All right, y'all, welcome to Joffrey the Giant. Today we're going to talk about race and the church. Well, we're going to approach it through an unusual angle, I think. We're going to watch a video clip, and then I'm going to talk about it. I want to thank viewer Evie for sharing this YouTube channel on Discord, Woke Preacher Clips. If you'd like to participate in our conversation off camera, then you're very welcome to join our Discord server through the link below. So Evie shared this channel with me. I've been looking at it and seeing some pretty amazing over-the-top racist clips. Now, today I'm going to be sharing a clip from Tim Keller about missionaries raising their own funds being an example of systemic racism. Okay. Now, if that hits you right off the bat as being a really dumb thing to say, it's actually not a dumb thing to say, and I'll talk about why that is, but it is wrong and it is extremely harmful. So missionaries raising their own funds, a great example of systemic racism. This will be a slightly longer video. What I want to do is to play this clip. I'll stop it a couple of times to comment, but I'll try to maintain my personal discipline and play through it relatively quickly. It's 3.5 minutes. And then we'll talk about this video. We'll talk about the theme generally. We'll talk about, well, let's not talk about everything we're going to talk about. Let's get into the clip.
Of systemic racism is the traditional evangelical approach to fundraising, in which you ask Christian staff workers to raise their own support. Okay, so I see that as systemic injustice, in spite of the fact that there's, frankly, our denomination does it, both for missionaries and great example of system.
Now, before we get started, I do want you to keep an eye out for an annoying little tick he has. When Tim Keller thinks he's saying something controversial or difficult, he does this combination cringe/simper at least 3 times during this video. So besides listening to the ideas he is propounding, enjoy hunting for his combination cringe/simper. Here we go.
Example of systemic racism is the traditional evangelical approach to fundraising, in which you ask Christian staff workers to raise their own support. Okay, so I see that as systemic injustice, in spite of the fact that there's, frankly, our denomination does it, both for missionaries and for RUF, Reformed University Fellowship. The reality is, after 50 years of watching people do this, I never realized, in other words, it's not just African Americans, but Hispanic and Asian Americans, even Asian Americans who've had a couple generations of people in this country, and everybody's a professional. They still can't raise their own support. It took me 50 years to realize that accumulated wealth in your family and friendship networks takes generations to develop. Generations. So recent immigrants or African Americans who've been here from the beginning, but who, because of slavery, then Jim Crow laws, then redlining, then everything, is they've got no money in their networks. They just don't. And if you send them out there and say, raise your own support, they can't. So then what happens is,
now, he's glossing over the fact that there are missionary cultures, right? It takes a certain kind of acculturation, and it's not strictly driven financially, right? Some, like if you talk about immigrant families particularly, they're far less likely to give to missionaries, and not just because of generational wealth, not just because of accumulated wealth, but because of cultural issues, which are completely glossed over here. But this is a legitimate thing he's bringing up. This is real. Okay, accumulated wealth, generational wealth is real. Now, don't get your underpants in a wad. Let's keep watching, and I'll have more to say.
Many of these evangelical organizations, they basically are, because they can't do that, they never move up and really become part of the power. And
I have to stop it here again just to comment that this is also something legitimate. Okay, so there are a lot of pastors, say, who are called to a small town church, and it's a small church, and that's where they spend 50 years of their lives, and that's absolutely wonderful. Okay, and the same is true of missionaries. They have a modest call. They stay with that particular work for their entire lives. Let's say a Bible translator who works with a specific people for 60 years, okay, or a church planter who goes to a particular area and is a very difficult area. It takes him 20 years just to get the church actually rolling, and he spends 40 years of his life just at that church. Yet that, I think, is our ideal of what a missionary is. But the truth is that both of those organizations need, both of those people need organizations behind them, right? Bible translators take Bible translation agencies with enormous teams, because Bible translation is actually a big work with lots of checks and balances. Okay. Church planting, maybe not quite as much, but there are organizations that you can move up through and almost treat it like a career path. And that's actually, it's helpful that some people do that, right? So, you have your own project, your own work for a few years, and then you start managing and helping other missionaries doing the same thing you used to do. Next thing you know, you're the second in charge of the whole thing, and then you're a little older, you're in charge of the whole thing. This is legitimate to actually talk about, well, who is doing this? And this is actually something that is on my heart when I think about missionaries, my own missionary background, and the different backgrounds of types of missionaries out there. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit more. So I think he actually brings up two very relevant issues in modern missions.
has our denomination and our participated in that? Yes, it still is. That's a pretty uncomfortable thing to say. But the fact is that if we started to say, oh, guess, you know what, we're going to totally change that. We're going to fund everybody centrally. We're going to raise money centrally and then just pay all of our workers. Now, the reality is that it's much harder to raise money that way. And it takes more time and effort and all that. And so these mission organizations and denominations don't want to do it. And they won't even be open to it. But it's a version of systemic racism.
I wonder if they're not open to centralizing.
My guess is a lot of people on the call, unless you've been involved in the evangelical world for a long time, don't even maybe know what I'm talking about. But I mean, Anthony does, and Susan and Jeff certainly do, and it's just a blind spot. And why can't we address that? Why can't we say we're going to try to do something about that? You really could, frankly. I think there are things you could do. So it's not like it, but unless you have the discussions, these things, most of us, especially us white people, just sort of, this is the way it's always been done. And I'm not a racist, so how could you call that systemic racism? Every time I ever bring it up, I just never get any response from anybody. People just say, oh, that's Tim's hobby horse. But it's if you're non-white and you've tried to raise your own support in one of these organizations, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In fact, to me.
Okay, so one of the things that strikes me is that he's talking about a certain way of doing things. Dare we say it, to flip the woke script, a white way of doing things. He's saying that there's a certain way to be a missionary. It is to raise funds from your own network. That's how you get to be a missionary. Maybe that's the white way, Timmy.
It was one of the things that proved the reality of the hangover. I mean, just how deeply our past is affecting African Americans now.
Okay.
The whole idea.
All right. So let's unpack a few things here. Yeah. All right. So the idea of systemic racism is not noxious to me, although I know that it is noxious to most of my viewers. As far as it being a sociological concept, right? Uh, I think the term itself is unhelpful, but the phenomenon that people want to get certain things done, and there are certain groups that have innate advantages to get those things done. That's just a truth. Okay. And some of these things that people want to do are very laudable and very good. But of course, they're not the only way of being. And this is the constant hypocrisy with wokeness, right? The constant whites are shutting us out of power that we want, and yet the power of whites is poisonous, and white people are terrible, and whiteness itself is a thing, is a way of life, is a philosophy, and that is obnoxious, and we need to eliminate it, but give us the whiteness, right? It's the same hypocrisy that we see in feminism, when feminists really what they're doing is adoring the masculine, idolizing the masculine, masculinity for everyone. So the racial hypocrisy is whiteness for everyone, but we hate whiteness. Okay. So this is something that what Keller is bringing up is something that does bother me as a Brazilian. Brazil is one of the greatest sending countries in the world, but it would be much greater if its coin weren't so bad and so unreliable. So every time the economy tanks, missionaries come back from all over Africa, from all over Europe, from all over Asia, because the Brazilian church can no longer afford to project these missionaries into these theaters, particularly, obviously, Europe and North America. Okay. And the United States continues to be the greatest sending country. I believe they're 7 times greater than the next closest. So it's enormous. And there's no denying that a large part of that is the facility that Americans have relatively in raising resources. And the exchange rate is almost always helpful, right? So you can live on X amount here. Well, you can live on half of that or a third of that and still live well in a given mission field. So obviously that has an enormous impact. Now, the idea that first of all, okay, there's so many things I want to unpack with this. Let me show first this article. Okay, so here we have an article from on IMB, the International Mission Board, which is the sending agency for the Southern Baptist Convention, which is very large. It says race matters, why we must send more missionaries of color. I grew up in historically Black churches. I planted an inner city church. Now I pastor a multi-ethnic congregation, and I work with planters in urban communities. I only know one Black missionary serving on the field today, just one. And that is remarkable. Urban communities, urban is so often code for Black, right? But without question, he is dealing with some multi-ethnic congregations, and certainly there would be congregations that would be majority minority. Okay, this is one Doug Logan. So although I may kind of my first instinct on seeing a headline like this is whoa, the wokeness. I actually get that. I get the desire for representation. Okay, now so he sees a problem. He believes this is a problem. So he has a bunch of things that people should think about so how to address the current lack of color. The first thing he talks about, reclaim our colorful heritage of missions. So this is the first thing I thought about when watching the Tim Keller video. Now, I'm sure that Pastor Logan and I would not be on the same page about a lot of things, but obviously what Keller is saying is an insult to the tradition of Black and minority missionaries from the United States, because this guy is particularly interested in the United States. The US must produce more colored missionaries. There is a history. Take George Lely, for example. He was America's first missionary, full stop. Lot Carey purchased his freedom from slavery. Betsy Stockton. Okay. And if you study, like, when I lived in South Carolina, I studied some of the history of Presbyterianism in South Carolina, and some of those Black pastors and the work that they did for Blacks before and after the war. Marvelous, marvelous work. What disrespect to the work that those men and women did. You don't have to just raise money from your friends. If you want to be a missionary, get about it, get going, and start it. And in fact, people do. If a Brazilian can manage to get the training and the funding to go be a missionary in Germany, then you can manage the funding as well. And that is, in fact, what people do. Now, everywhere you go, there's going to be disequality. There's going to be, people are going to have advantages or disadvantages. That's just how it is. And people just get about their work. So just get about your work. Keller's solution of centralizing funds is a nightmare. There are organizations that, in fact, do, let's call it, collate funds for certain types of missionary works. And they're all, of course, not in the global South. And there are things about that system that I don't like. For example, the money is much more likely to go to Americans, and American missionaries and European missionaries have an inordinate amount of power compared to, say, their African brethren or their Southeast Asian brethren or their Latin American brethren. And that frustrates me. And I am actually working on some projects to, in my own small way, be able to impact that. And it goes beyond money, right? But money is at the root of it, because, hey, you have a project in mind, we can make it happen. Those organizations that do a little bit of centralizing, one of the things they have to constantly fight against is the corruption that their presence causes, the lust that their presence causes. Imagine that it's always been your passion to start a sports ministry in some town in backwater Peru, and you yourself are Peruvian and you're from that region, and along comes an organization that is into sports ministry, and they have money. You are going to face serious temptations, and people do. And these organizations are aware that these temptations happen. Sometimes they abuse them, to be quite frank. The centralization is a terrible idea. And it strikes me that, so as I was watching that video, I was thinking of the book When Helping Hurts: How to Alleviate Poverty Without Hurting the Poor and Yourself. So this is a book. This is by Steve Corbett and Brian Fickert. This book is enormously popular in the circles that love Tim Keller. Okay, I first became aware of it when we started attending a church that was planted in a downtown for the city. They absolutely loved Tim Keller, and this book was constantly, the title of this book was constantly being dropped, and informed the way they thought about ministry. There's actually a lot of really great stuff in it, right? Don't just go throwing money around is basically the thesis. Okay, in other ways, empower people to be able to prosper more, get their work done. Okay. Now, I've seen this so much around Kellerites that I assumed that if I looked, if I Googled Tim Keller and this book, that I would see a review or his opinion. I didn't actually. I was surprised. Look, here's just one of several churches that popped up when I searched. Hey, some books that they suggest on community engagement, a deeper look at poverty, Biblical Justice by Tim Keller. Here's another book by Tim Keller, Generous Justice by Tim Keller, and When Helping Hurts by Steve Corbett and Brian Fickert. Okay, so this book is enormously popular in Kellerite circles. I didn't find him talking about it, but this theme is one that he constantly beats his drum to, of empowering people to do it themselves when thinking about ministry. Well, this completely antithetical to suggest a centralized solution. It just shows what a spin he's gone into as he's become more woke. I find it disheartening that the church is leaving behind the gospel to focus on social constructs. And that's not to say that the gospel doesn't have social ramifications. It is a kingdom. Of course it does. It changes and will change the world. Reality around you, including social reality, changes with King Jesus. But if you start with the social reality, if you start with the social ills you see, that will become what your kingdom is about. Jesus is king, and all the nations stream to him. All the nations are in this city. Let's proclaim that Jesus is king, and let people serve him as they may, regardless of the number of talents they have. Talents as in money. Oh, man. Now, obviously, for him, talking about systemic racism, whenever people talk about that, and mentioning the Anthony Bradley in this panel, obviously race and blackness and whiteness in America was a big part of his conception. He mentioned Asians. So, and he's talking about the United States. Okay. But the fact is, the global South is doing so much for the proclamation of the gospel, so much for missions, and they don't need you. The Black urban church planter does not need you. The Black man or the Vietnamese man from the United States, right? The child of immigrants or the son of slaves does not need you to go be a missionary to Muslims in France. They need to get about their work in the name of Jesus. There are practical needs. The church can take care of it. The Black church has buildings. The Black church has potlucks. The Black church has families. There may be a crisis with families in the Black community. There are other crises that white churches, I just hate saying that. The idea of Black and white churches, I didn't see that until I moved to North America. I remember watching Coming to America when I was young in Brazil. I couldn't understand it. There was this guy hollering up on a stage, and I had no frame of reference for Black church culture versus white church culture. And then we moved to North America. We ended up in a Black church. Hey, look, it's just like Coming to America. I mean, that's just a tragedy, but that's a separate tragedy. If you are passionate about that as a white person, then give to some Black missionaries. Just get about it. Empower them as much as you are able. But to insult those who don't go about their work the way you do is a tragedy, is disgusting. I've used the word tragedy too much. Part of the error of thinking here is one that is becoming more and more American across racial lines, and that is institutionalization. You don't need the International Mission Board. Would it make things easier? In a lot of ways, it would. It also can complicate things. It will certainly impact your mission. You don't need MTW. Now, there's nothing wrong with working through IMB or MTW or any other missions organization, but let folks get about their work. All right, that's all I have for you guys. It is likely that this did not impact you the same way it did me. Doesn't matter. I appreciate you hanging out. Drop your comments below. What's going on with Tim Keller? I mean, it's already gone, isn't it? What's gone on with Tim Keller? Feel free to join the Discord. I'd love to welcome you there. The peace of Christ be upon you.